Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you especially to all our esteemed panelists. I'm Shelley Spector, Director of the Museum of Public Relations here in New York. Thank you all for joining us today for the first of our three-part series on propaganda and democracy. We believe this is the first program, at least in our industry, to explore the role of communicators in helping to protect democracy, not just here, but around the world. With our very way of life in jeopardy, I felt it was critical now to bring this issue to the forefront. We know at the Museum of PR that communications is most often used, we like to think, to help the public. Indeed, we even published a book called Public Relations for the Public Good. But we also have to face the fact that communications can and often is used for evil purposes. Throughout history, as you'll see, big lies have been used as weapons to spark hatred, spread extremism, launch war. As communicators, we hold enormous power in our own hands. We have the ability to call out disinformation, to identify the sources of lies, and to protect the dissemination of truth. And without the truth, democracies like ours will only continue to weaken. Thank you to our sponsors, the Grady College at the University of Georgia, Amazon, Jim Lukashevsky, Page, Muckrack, and of course, Compro. Now I'll hand the mic back to Todd and let the program begin.
Thank you, Shelley. Hi, my name is Todd Helmus. I'm a senior behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation, where I've applied my trade examining such topics as extremism and disinformation, topics that I think play a key role in this series that we're going to be addressing here today. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this first installment of what's going to be a series of 3 symposiums. The series is going to explore how propaganda and disinformation have led to an increasingly divided America. We particularly want to examine what communicators and others can do to help save democracy. Today's symposium will be followed by 2 additional events, and I encourage you all, if you haven't already, to register for those. You can go to the PR Museum's website on the events list. The second event, which will be held in 2 weeks on August 18, will examine how QAnon, the Proud Boys, and extremist media have destroyed public trust. In the third event, 2 weeks after that, on September 1, we will look to identify solutions to this space and understand how communicators can help preserve democracy by countering propaganda, disinformation, and violent extremism. But today, I think we really have an opportunity to have a special event by looking at the history of propaganda from the Nazis and Stalin to present-day Rohingya crisis, and understand the parallels between these events and what we might be experiencing here in the United States today. Before I introduce our guests, and I want to just note that RAND is delighted to be able to be a co-sponsor of this event. For several years now, RAND has been launching the Truth Decay initiative that has really been seeking to understand and explore what is really a diminishing role of facts and analysis in public life. And so this is really up our alley, and we're just extremely excited to be a part of this event. And we want to thank, really grateful for the Museum of Public Relations for sponsoring this. So now on to the show, and I'd like to introduce the 3 guest speakers that we have here today. Starting with Dr. Stephen Luckert. He is Senior Program Curator at the Levine Institute for the Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. He has served for 20 years as a curator of the museum's acclaimed permanent exhibition, The Holocaust. And in addition, he has curated The State of Deception, The Power of Nazi Propaganda. Second, we are delighted to have Dr. Gavin Wild. Gavin is a senior fellow, Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Gavin studies Russia and information warfare, and he most recently served on the National Security Council as the director for Russia, Baltic, and Caucasus Affairs. Finally, we have Dr. Lisa Bruton. She is the associate professor in the College of Arts and Media in Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Her research and publications focus on human rights and media, media reform and democratization, social movement media, community and indigenous media, and in particularly she brings expertise on Southeast Asia, where she has, among other things, studied the Rohingya refugee crisis. So with that, we'll jump in. The way we'll structure today's events is I will highlight 3 key questions for the moderators that they'll go in turn to address. And then we'll turn it over to the audience. And we're delighted to have questions. If you see questions that come up in the course of this talk that you want to share with us, please do so. You can either use the chat function, or I think there's also a Q&A function on your screen. So with that, let's get started. And I would like to start with Dr. Luckert. Stephen, before the Nazis instigated World War II and perpetrated really one of the greatest, if not the greatest, atrocity in human history, they first had to wield power in Germany and lay the groundwork among the German people. How did they do this?
I think one of the things we have to realize is that it was during the 1920s and 30s that the Nazi Party really honed its skills as propagandists. This was kind of what they considered the golden age of propaganda. And one of the things that I think we need to think about is really how modern, even contemporary, the Nazis were. So that, for instance, they were able to market themselves, to brand themselves in order to distinguish themselves from their competitors. And you have to remember, Germany after the First World War became a republic, but you had about 30 different political parties competing for votes and support. So for many of these political parties, you had to distinguish yourself from the rest. And of course, one of the things that the Nazis were able to do was really to brand themselves, brand their leader, and brand their movement to distinguish themselves. Adolf Hitler, for instance, played a major role in crafting a public persona of himself as a political leader. And remember, this is a guy that never held political office in his life. But when he ran for the presidency of Germany in 1932, he got 14 million votes. He was able to create this image of a leader of strength, will, and determination that would be able to get Germany out of the Great Depression. And you have to realize that the Nazis, for much of the 1920s, were really kind of an extremist party with a limited support. But by the time the Great Depression struck, 1929, the Nazis began to harness their skills as propagandists to win support. And branding was one of those ways. Likewise, when you think about the swastika, the Nazi flag, this was a trademark, a logo that separated them from other political parties. And remember, most political parties in Germany did not have a logo or a trademark. Likewise, the Nazis presented themselves as a very different type of party, a party that aimed to unite all Germans, regardless of class, regardless of religion, or what region you came from. And so what they were arguing is that they were a movement that was bringing people together. Now, of course, what they meant by that was all ethnic Germans, that Jews were excluded automatically. Jews were considered a separate race, and were excluded from membership in this Volksgemeinschaft, this people's community that the Nazis promoted. And of course, that becomes very important when the Nazis come to power in 1933. Remember, Hitler by 1933 is the leader of the largest party in the German parliament, and he's appointed chancellor. And almost immediately, he begins implementing his radical measures. And in less than 6 months, Germany goes from being a state with over 30 political parties to being a state with just one. You have the first concentration camp set up. The civil rights of all Germans are taken away within the first month. In that first 100 days, the first anti-Jewish legislation occurs. And so the Nazis work very quickly. And one of the things that they do is to try to to use propaganda to identify those groups that don't fit into this notion of a national community. And the Jews, of course, were seen as one of the key groups that had to be identified. And so they did all kinds of things. This is a poster for an exhibition called the Ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew, or the Wandering Jew. And you see this representation of an Eastern European Jew holding the tools of his trade, what he promises for Germany, a communist Germany symbolized by the hammer and sickle on the map of Germany, as well as the gold coins in his hand symbolizing capitalism. So the notion that Jews exploit this for their own benefit, that the Jews, for instance, are engaged in an international conspiracy to take over the world. And of course, this was something that they very carefully marketed during the Second World War, that they blamed the Jews for starting the war and said the Jews are behind all the enemy powers, which is what this poster that was done by the Nazis shows. So this is an example of the kind of branding that I was talking about for Adolf Hitler. The use of the swastika, a flag as a trademark, as a logo. The notion of creating something that was new and different in Germany, that was bringing people together, that in a polarized society, promoting themselves as the only party that spoke for all Germans. The ways in which propaganda was used to identify and ostracize Jews and others, beginning in the 1930s, for the goals of mass immigration from Germany, and then to portray Jews as an existential threat to Germany that had to be dealt with radical measures. And this was something that they promoted throughout Europe. So that what we see here is this poster that was done in Serbo-Croatian, which says his tools: democracy, Freemasonry, communism, and capitalism. And it shows the Jews, this representative of international Jewry, using these spiders as part of this effort to take control of the world. And this is something that the Nazis firmly believed in this conspiracy theory. And they also used this to justify increasingly harsh measures against the Jews. The Jews represented a threat regardless of where they lived, whether that's in the United States, whether that's in the Soviet Union, whether that's in London or in Germany, so that even your neighbor represents a threat to you. And so this was something that was used. The Nazis also, you have this notion that we see creeping up in other genocides too, where the perpetrators would say, we're only defending ourselves. If we didn't carry out these brutal actions, these killings, they would do it to us. And so this is something that you see running throughout much of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda, that Germany is defending itself against an international and powerful threat.
Thank you. That was awesome. Now let me turn it over to Gavin. When it comes to propaganda, just in general, I often think of the Russian propaganda assault against the U.S. election in 2016. I'm sure many Americans think of the same thing when we think about foreign propaganda. But obviously, Russia has a long history of using propaganda to include supporting Stalin's Cultural Revolution, then of course on to the Soviet Active Measures campaign. Can you go back in time a little bit and talk about Stalin's campaign to shape the Russian public?
Absolutely. Thanks, Todd. I think, yeah, it's very important to note that Stalin and Lenin before him kind of understood that propaganda wasn't merely a tool to advance the communist cause, but it needed to be all-encompassing and infusing every aspect of daily life. Bear in mind that in 1917, around the time of the October Revolution, most of the Russian Empire was illiterate. And so, as Edward Bernays may have spoke of engineering consent, the Bolshevik propaganda strategist Lunacharsky might have spoken of engineering the new Soviet man or the new Soviet citizen. So propaganda wasn't merely strategic communications, but it infused everything from art to sculpture to literature, because it was designed to both educate and cultivate this revolutionary fervor from what they viewed as largely a blank slate, or to kind of reset the imperial slate as they found it. So this social engineering, or what historians of the Soviet Union would call socialist realism, essentially set about to replace objective reality and foster a shared consciousness that was exclusively sanctioned by the state. And so the hallmarks of propaganda in Soviet Russia under Stalin broadly can be binned into three categories as I see it. Number one, the cult of personality around Stalin himself, casting him as something of a godlike figure, the indispensable leader of the people and the rightful heir to Marxism and Leninism. And then number two, the molding of the new Soviet citizen, as I said, in the sense of exceptionalism that accompanied the global aspirations of the communist cause. And then finally, three, the mobilization of the population for specific goals, initially economic ones and then later military ones. So essentially in each of these three categories, however, the socialist ideology and the primacy of the Communist Party came to supplant whatever moral frameworks might have otherwise existed. So for example, religious ones, or even those that govern kind of familial relationships, making the citizens' primary patriotic duty to the state, but also their professional duty and their personal duty, which meant that any action up to and including violence could be justified in some way, so long as it was in support of the Soviet system. So now here's another case that similar to Dr. Luckert. In each of these categories, one can find extensive use of othering, which is essentially identifying and stigmatizing those out groups and consolidating and sanctifying the in-group, which in this case is the upright Soviet citizen that sacrifices all in the name of Stalin and the Communist Party and the socialist cause more broadly. And initially, those out-groups included the capitalists, the bourgeois elite, the imperialist Westerner. Later, that came to be traitors to Stalin, like Trotsky and other Bolsheviks who had fallen out of favor with him, and those as he consolidated power through the purges of the mid-1930s. Here, the threat of violence was primarily indirect and implicit, as that fear and paranoia kind of infected the intelligentsia and the citizenry. However, World War II changed everything and brought the violence and horrors of war to the forefront of public consciousness. And here on the left, you see a very popular poem written by a correspondent a war correspondent in 1942 regarding the Germans. And this poem is still read and commemorated annually during May 9th celebrations in Russia, including by school children. And as you can see, the verbiage is quite jarring and quite graphic, but the war kind of brought that imagery, and as Dr. Luckert referred to, that sense of a besieged fortress to the forefront, and kind of put the horrors of war at the forefront of public consciousness. So as Hitler reneged on the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact and the Nazis invaded Russia in 1941, Soviet propaganda took a remarkable turn from a communist expansionism towards that more siege mentality to galvanize the public in support of the war effort. It became more nationalistic and anti-German in tone, and the allusions to violence, as you can see here, became much more explicit. Patriotic appeals began to overshadow those earlier themes of class struggle, and anti-religious themes soon disappeared altogether. Caricatures of the rich landowner and the capitalist gave way to attacks on the Nazi war machine and on the German people writ large.
Great, thanks, Gavin. All right, let's go on to Lisa. Lisa, in 2017, armed attacks, massive scale of violence forced thousands of Rohingya to flee their homes in Myanmar. Estimates suggest as many as 25,000 were killed, 18,000 suffered gang rapes and other forms of systemic sexual assault. And the violence was perpetrated by the Myanmar, not only the Myanmar military, but also citizens of the country of Myanmar. The United States, of course, has described Rohingya as the most persecuted minority in the world. How did it come to this?
Thank you very much, Todd. Thanks for inviting me to join this conversation. A couple of contextual points that I would like to make first. The government has claimed, the Myanmar government has claimed that the violence was really intercommunal religious violence. And I think that there's enough analysis now to really question that. These are people who had lived peacefully together prior to the 2012 wave of violence. The two most recent waves of violence were in 2012 and 2017. And these are people who had really lived together quite peacefully prior to 2012, for the most part, right? So the question becomes, why is this such useful violence for the state? What's going on here? One thing we see after these waves of violence is that the government increased the level of security in the country, and further reinforced the segregation of the Rohingya population, which actually has been suppressed throughout the different decades of the country's history, but really at key moments when it became useful for the Myanmar state to deflect attention from other things that were going on. So what we saw was an othering, that this resonates with both of what you guys were speaking about, the othering of the Rohingya as an existential threat here, and requiring the unity of the other groups in this multi-ethnic country. The nature and scale of the attacks, especially in 2017, suggests that there was a lot of pre-planning and design going on here. And the outcome really was to reinforce the role of the military as key to security in Myanmar, right? To reinforce their father figure role there. So in terms of propaganda, I think 3 points I would like to make about what was happening there. First of all, there was a simultaneous limiting of freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, especially among the Rohingya, while there was simultaneously government, military, and other folks, a fomentation of hate speech and incitement of violence online. So we saw from 2011 to 2015, increasing numbers of human rights abuses and the silencing of critical voices by Myanmar authorities, while simultaneously amplifying hateful rhetoric. And this was going on at the same time that we had a massive liberalization of the telecommunications sector in the country. In 2014, the sector was liberalized and 2 foreign firms were invited in. So we had, within the course of a few years, we had a massive influx and increase in the use of mobile phones and access to social media among people all around the country. That was very rapid, and I think that played a very important role. And it's one thing that makes this case study different from the other 2 that we're talking about tonight. And we also found that the government's response, so we had the military fomenting a lot of this, but the government's response to this hate speech was also inadequate, according to UN fact-finding mission of Myanmar's 2018 report. So the first one, as I mentioned, this is simultaneously limiting of freedom of speech while at the same time fomenting hate speech. And then secondly, which also resonates with what we've already heard, a propaganda promoted through the normalization of exclusionary rhetoric. So we have a history of this in the country. We have a history of the definition in Myanmar of what are called national races. And the Rohingya are not considered one of those. So this became one way in which to stigmatize this group of people. Even the name Rohingya was not really a matter of debate at all in the country among non-Rohingya. I mean, other than the few people who were warning about what was going on and opposing what was happening. But for the most part, the majority of the population in the state was arguing that the Rohingya do not exist as an actual group. So they refused to use this term. They referred to the Rohingya as illegal Bengali immigrants. They referred to things like the uncontrollable birth rates and calling for patriotic action in order to protect race and religion, the Burma Buddhist identity that was really being reinforced in contradistinction to what they were talking about with the Rohingya, right? Also important to understand the lack of legal status. Rohingya do not have legal status because they were not one of these national races. And then the third point that I want to make is the use of social media in this particular case. The use of social media and also the slow response on the part of social media and specifically Facebook. So the New York Times investigation, which was reported in October 2018, shows a systematic and wide-ranging campaign of using fake names, trolls, news and celebrity pages in order to flood them with incendiary content, and specifically at peak usage times, so times when there were a lot of people online. Facebook itself then followed up with its own investigation and confirmed that the campaign was systematic, covert, and directly connected to the Myanmar military. The New York Times investigation pointed out that this was among the first examples of an authoritarian state using the social network against its own people. And a couple of final points by the UN fact-finding mission. They point out that Facebook was significant in the fomenting of this massacre, the massacres that went on. And I would point out, just in terms of numbers, in 2012, 140,000 people were displaced. In 2017, 725,000 Rohingya fled the country. And many of them, as you mentioned, suffered human rights abuses. Many of them died on the way. We saw reports of people drowning. And also many of them lost their lives because of landmines planted by the Myanmar military. One thing that was pointed out as part of many of the investigations around this was that Facebook was deeply statist in its approach to this regime, so to this situation. And so we saw a Rohingya rebel group have their Facebook page removed after attacks in 2017. And yet the Myanmar military was not affected on Facebook until August of 2018, despite this kind of scorched earth campaign that we saw. So that was a problem that many activists in Myanmar flagged. And then finally, I just want to make one point, which is that there were many civil society organizations in Myanmar that were warning Facebook and were working very much on the ground, recognizing, already trying to counter the fake news, the flow of misinformation and disinformation on the network. And they were very frustrated with the slow response of Facebook, working very hard to try to warn them about many aspects of what was going on. So we can talk more about that.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Next, I want to sort of ask a question, open to you all, maybe take a minute or so to answer this. But obviously, thankfully, the United States is free of genocide, but we're having our own issues right now. More than 2,000 rioters attacked the U.S. Capitol in an insurrection. A third of U.S. adults suggest that violence against the government may be justified. And then, of course, attacks against minorities and hate crimes have gone through the roof. The FBI says we're at a 13-year high on those items. So I'm just curious, what parallels do you see between the Nazis, the Russians, the Myanmar military, and the tools that they used to what is happening today and the domestic issues we're experiencing? Gavin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think from a Russia perspective, there's certainly parallels with the current day approach and with the context of the war in Ukraine. I think one of the biggest differences is the reach of the available technologies to amplify and influence those beyond their own borders. Once again, the Kremlin's kind of occupied by a leader who's deified and whose grip on power appears absolute. And so some of those that same tradecraft is used to consolidate power, both in Moscow, but I think writ large propaganda, it can be used in that way. But it also kind of the implicit threat of violence in propaganda in the context of certainly of the conflict in Ukraine, but elsewhere, similar to what Dr. Bruton said, I think that sense of that siege mentality, or that the ability to cast these things, these atrocities or this violence in defensive terms or counter-offensive terms, seems to be a dominant theme that I think carries over into the current day. And I think there's also, of course, a lot of blatant historical revisionism and kind of spurious application of terminology and imagery of enemies and ideological incursion and othering that kind of spans across time and continues to be kind of a tool in the toolbox that serves to dehumanize others and then ultimately justify, violence against them.
Thanks, Kevin. Lisa, what do you think?
I hate to pick on the big tech companies, but I'm going to do that.
Yes, that's why we're talking about this subject. So go ahead.
I think the role of social media is vital here. The use of troll farms, fake accounts, coordinated campaigns. We see this not only in the United States and Myanmar, but of course around the world. We're seeing this. The Rohingya have brought a $150 billion lawsuit against Facebook, and they have argued a few things that I think are worth paying attention to. One is that the algorithms, of course, amplify hate speech, and we are aware, I think, that the algorithms do emphasize that kind of content that is emotional and sensational. They also point out that Facebook failed to invest in local moderators and fact checkers, and I want to make this point in terms of, I'll make this point when we go to our next discussion of lessons learned. But I think one thing it's important to recognize is that Facebook has really failed to distinguish the local context in many places around the world. Not just, I wouldn't say just Facebook, but Facebook in this particular case was the main culprit. But of course, all the big tech companies are dealing with this right now, right? They also failed to take down specific posts and didn't shut down specific accounts or delete groups and pages that were encouraging violence fast enough. We also know that an internal Facebook report found that the social media platforms algorithms enabled disinformation campaigns that were coming out of Eastern Europe during the US elections in 2020. So specifically through the content recommendation system, and yet after the 2016 election, we had some evidence of that as well, and Facebook really failed to kind of prioritize fundamental changes about how the platform promotes and distributes information. So I think that also in all of these cases, it's a case of a little bit too little, too late. There were moves to take down accounts both of the Myanmar military and some of the problematic extremist groups in the United States, but kind of well after a lot of the damage had already been done. So I think those are two key points we should keep in mind. Thanks,
Lisa. And then over to you, Dr. Lucker. What were you thinking about as you watched the riot at the U.S. Capitol?
Well, it's very interesting when you think about the kinds of parallels that exist, with the incitement to violence, et cetera. But I think one of the things that the Nazis did that we see, I think, played out in this ISIS did this in their world, and you see this in the many extremist groups today, which is to appeal to those that are disillusioned with the status quo, to emphasize that those in power don't speak for them, that you need to turn to an alternative. And as the Nazis presented themselves at that time as a viable alternative, as outsiders that were not responsible, which is something they played on, that they weren't responsible for all the problems, economic and social problems that existed, and that give them a chance to change things. So they appealed to voter frustration, voter anger, and also gave this notion of hope that by voting for them, you can change things. You can restore German greatness by casting your vote. And they did this, you know, with, and we see this today, this kind of niche marketing. The Nazis, you know, tailored their messages to different groups, whether those are workers, women, students, etc., in order to win over these disparate groups. And I think what you see, you know, today is the ways in which now social media allows people to, propagandists, to tailor their messages to an individual, not just a social group or a gender, but to an individual. And this is something different, but it shows, you know, the Nazis were learners about how technology can disseminate a message. You know, if radio was the internet of that time, they saw the importance of that. Now social media is, you know, for a lot of extremists. This is a way in which not only can they make global connections between each other and spread their message, but they can amplify those. And they don't even have to be people. They could be trolls, they could be bots. They could be just, you know, to give that message, you know, much wider distribution than it would have, you know, so that these small groups can actually, you know, build up a larger following, even though they're relatively small.
Yeah, it makes me wonder what the Nazis would have done with Facebook and other technologies that really allow them to sort of micro target audiences and then directly engage with them. So, you know, one of the other question series I have is talking about the, you know, what lessons we can learn about countering propaganda. But I thought I'd take a couple questions from the audience, and one anonymous attendee really pointed this out. We haven't defined propaganda. What is propaganda? Has propaganda always been a bad thing? Today we imply that propaganda is this terrible thing that only happens when others try to influence us or influence us on things we don't like, but it hasn't always been that way. And maybe Stephen, maybe you're the guy to talk about this. What is the definition of propaganda, and what's the history of the term?
Well, I use a rather broad definition of it, which is biased information that's designed to shape public opinion and behavior, and that it frequently plays upon emotions rather than reason. It is, you know, something that dates back even prior to the term. The term is a Latin one, and it originally, you know, referred to the propagation of the flora and fauna, and then it became linked with the Catholic Church during the Counter-Reformation and a kind of a missionary zeal to spread the faith throughout the world. And then in the late 19th century, early 20th, it became identified with political messaging. But particularly in wartime. And it was really the First World War that kind of marked the kind of global public awareness of the power of propaganda, both as a military tool and as for shaping opinion. But it was something that, you know, various proponents saw that could be used for not only evil purposes, but for good ones, you know, so that some would argue, and I think Bernays would be one of these, that would say that, you know, women got their vote as a result of propaganda, or that public service messaging, you know, public health messaging might be construed as that it has an overall positive good message, you know, that but it has you know, particular biases to it.
So one of the other questions that I had was, you know, what are the lessons for countering this stuff right now? And what lessons might communicators think about in attempting to, you know, turn people's opinions away from this type of propaganda, or to shield them from it or protect them from this? And Gavin, I know as someone who's been working at the NSC, I know you've been thinking a lot about this particular topic, and my guess is it's been a focus of a lot of your work. And I'm just curious your thoughts on, and either resort back to the Stalin era or to modern day, you know, efforts to counter Russian propaganda. But what are the lessons that stick out in your mind?
So I think one of the major things that shifts from the Stalin era to today, I think much more in the Stalin era, propaganda was designed to advance a specific narrative, like an affirmational agenda. Much of what we're seeing today is essentially less an effort to try to shape a particular reality, but more an effort to try to undermine the very notion that objective reality exists. And so kind of speaking to that erosion of trust in institutions and trust in each other, and that sense of shared reality that communities have to thrive, that Dr. Luckert and Dr. Bruton kind of spoke of. At least from a Russia perspective, much of the effort is just designed to throw chaff so that narratives that are inimical to Kremlin objectives don't penetrate the Russian information space, as they call it, but also to try and confuse and distort, the public opinion more broadly globally, particularly as it pertains to policy objectives that Russia's pursuing. And so I think understanding that first and foremost, that some of these, when we talk about countering, sometimes narrative and counter narrative, too much of that can just simply kind of breed apathy and breed exhaustion among the populace. And the other thing I would highlight too is a lot of times we like to think that the more logical or the better articulated argument or narrative will prevail, but people respond emotionally. People respond to a better story. And often, as you can see from, I would point to the efforts that have been undertaken by Kyiv, like they simply are better at telling a story right now that appeals to people's sense of humanity, that appeals to people's sense of fairness and justice, et cetera, that really is what lends it resonance in a way that a lot of propaganda efforts, particularly from Moscow at present, just simply don't have. And so I would just highlight that the need to be compelling storytellers, but that also comes with a responsibility to be transparent, to be credible, to be honest, because that fusion of kind of verifiable information and emotional resonance alongside kind of a verifiable truth that has logic to it, there's power in that as far as countering disinformation or malign influence or propaganda from an adversarial state.
That's a great lesson. So the goal is don't respond to other propaganda, but tell your own story and do so in a compelling and honest way.
I think that's
now,
spot
on. For Lisa, let's see. What are the questions from the audience? And I'll tie this into a broader question, but the question from the audience member is, what are the ways to compel big tech companies such as Facebook and Twitter to reform their practices? What levers are available for reform? And let me nest a second question onto that, and you can answer both questions at your leisure. But you have written a pretty compelling book chapter about what civil society did in Myanmar to respond to the genocide and to the refugee crisis, and to support the Rohingya population and to counter misinformation on Facebook. And so I'm just curious, based on your observations there, what are the lessons for countering this stuff online?
Yeah, okay. So I think how to regulate big tech. I mean, that was one of the points I want to make. That's been very clear from people on the ground. And I just say also, I just come back from doing research in the Philippines, where this is another huge issue, huge issue, where basically the national narrative has been completely rewritten. And again, through very insidious, systematic campaigns using media and social media and so on. So definitely the need to regulate big tech is one thing where a lot of people are talking about, right? I think it's important to recognize, especially this has to happen in countries outside of the United States, where many of the democratic institutions are not as strong, but also there's in many places a very rapid increase and sudden increase in the use of social media and mobile telephony. So one thing I think we need to do is kind of think about the algorithms and how, I think we need to recognize that these algorithms are beneficial commercially, and to really question that. That was one of the things that the local civil society organizations mentioned to me, One of the people I interviewed actually said you cannot have control over a public space when it's moderated by financial interests. I think it's also really important to recognize that Facebook itself, this was a fact given to us by whistleblower Frances Haugen. 87% of the spending on combating misinformation of Facebook was spent on English language content, where only 9% of Facebook users are using English language content or are English speakers. So also, there are some draft legislation that is ongoing in the European Union that's kind of interesting to pay attention to. So I think thinking about regulation, how do we think about algorithms? What about spending priorities in terms of looking into what's actually happening? But also I think we are starting to see people use the courts. Certainly in the case of the genocide itself, the Gambia has opened a case in the International Court of Justice, but also, as I mentioned before, the Rohingya now have sued Facebook. So I think sort of thinking about the use of these lawsuits to kind of promote or really push these tech companies to think about change. And then the final point that I want to make is really relying on local people in countries who have been working on the ground for a long time. These are folks who have the cultural capital to be able to really understand when something is an incitement to violence or hate speech. Facebook has tended to try to emphasize its use of AI, which really doesn't have the cultural capital to understand the context, the local context. And so really thinking about that, trusting local communities that have been working on this stuff for a long time and really being more transparent with them, partnering with them much more so than is happening. And this is a theme that I've heard in multiple countries, not just Myanmar. I also work in Thailand and the Philippines. I want to wrap up here with a quote by one of the folks that I interviewed, one of the Myanmar people working in the civil society or digital rights community, specifically says that they've been telling Facebook this: if you really care about preventing problems, you shouldn't be testing your designs with focus groups of American users. You should be testing your stuff with people in countries like ours so you can mitigate the worst impacts of the technology. And if you want people with expertise about how a system can be misused, we probably have a lot more experience than you do. So I think those are all really key points that are very much coming from the folks that I've been talking to over the years.
Thanks, Lisa. I mean, it's really astounding. Facebook dedicates some 90% of its resources, moderation resources, to the United States. And then it goes into a new market like Myanmar and has just very few resources dedicated to it. It's just, there's just such a need for change, be it regulation or other forms of change in that industry. So thank you. One of the other questions that's come up, and I'll address this to Steve, these people are smart, they're not stupid. In Germany in particular, was one of the more educated and highly educated country in Europe, and industrial company, but they fell for this. And so one of the questions is that we get from, I think, Anonymous is, why do people accept these untruths? I mean, stuff's obviously false, right? Why and how can people suffer from this? What can you say about that? Not only just from the propaganda angle, but just why are people so gullible?
Well, I think sometimes it's very difficult to say, why people buy into some message. I mean, if you think about it, the Nazis were very skillful at promoting themselves at solving, all kinds of problems. So there were many Germans, for instance, that, said, oh, Hitler's doing a good job on the foreign policy front, or Hitler, created jobs, and put millions of people back to work. And often they were willing to overlook the kind of unsightly or negative aspects of this, and so that they would show their support for the regime because they like these. Then what they saw as the positive aspects of this. Now, you also have to remember that, for instance, the Nazis were very careful when Hitler ran for president, for instance, 1932, played down anti-Semitism because he realized that anti-Semitism alone isn't going to get him huge mass support. It appealed to a kind of a niche market. And so in areas where anti-Semitism was strong, they used it to a great deal. In other areas, they heard from local groups. They listened to what they were hearing at the ground level. They say, well, we're not interested in the Jewish question. We're interested in economic problems. So they would tailor their message to economic problems. But one of the things that the Nazis tried to do is that while inciting this kind of hatred of the Jews and other groups, they also fostered a climate of indifference, I think, which was very successful, perhaps much more successful, which was that the Jews aren't your problem, that they're their problem, but, it's, people would say, well, I have other things. I'm not particularly, interested in that. And so indifference had a very negative role, for Germans, looking at them, as their neighbors are being deported, they could say, well, I didn't do it. The Nazis aren't telling them to go out and kill their neighbors. They're telling them, let the state take care of this. The state's going to protect you from this threat. All you have to do is sit back and let it happen. And I think for me, that's a very scary thing, that, this indifference, even if you don't necessarily hate the group, but you don't say anything about it. That, I think, is a very real danger, and I think it's a danger today. I think what Gavin and Lisa have been bringing up about the power of human voice to counter this kind of speech is an important one that we should realize, particularly in democracy, when you have the right to do that, to use your voice to counter that kind of speech, to call that into question. And we know that in some cases in Kenya and elsewhere where people have countered this kind of violent speech, that it has been successful in quelling that. And so I think these are things that we have to realize, is to kind of get people to really think about the messages that we're bombarded with, and also to counter those ones that have very dangerous potential.
Did you, drawing from your experience with Nazi propaganda, are there lessons that you learned for countering this, or?
Well, I think that we're doing a lot of work, for instance, at the museum, to kind of educate people about understanding propaganda and how it works, and even getting them to think about, how you can get sucked into very positive imagery, and overlook the consequences that has for somebody else. I remember taking a group from Rwanda through the exhibition, when we had it, and they were talking about some of the similarities, and they weren't talking about just the use of inflammatory language like cockroaches, but this notion of bringing groups together, this kind of these what some might say is very positive messaging, but it had very negative consequences for other groups. And I think getting people to realize that in the construction of these national narratives, what it means for somebody else that doesn't fit into that. And I think for me, that's a very strong lesson that comes out of this, is to just get people to open their eyes to kind of the negative flip side of this very appealing propaganda.
Todd, if I could just underscore something I think important that Dr. Luckert said there, I think countering ignorance, we often try to counter the explicit and kind of deeply ingrained hatreds, which is absolutely necessary. But I think it's so important that the ignorance, so that the mere lack of exposure or understanding to some of these issues, as I'm sure there are folks that are less familiar with the plight of some of the history, with the plight of some of these groups, that if we can reach them where they are and kind of help them put on some, adopt some strategic empathy or put themselves in the shoes of the other, as Dr. Luckert says, I think that has so much power where some of the unconvincible elements of society that are harder to reach, who have already deeply entrenched views, that's a high mountain to climb in and of itself. But I think there's a lot of good work that can be done in kind of reaching those who simply just don't have the exposure to some of these issues, but that given that would really be allies and partners in this effort.
I love that word, strategic empathy. Lisa, do you want to riff on that topic?
Yeah, let me go back for a second too to the question of why people are buying into this too. I think media studies offers us some theories about this and some ideas. A history of research that shows, people are very good at selectively exposing themselves to messages that reinforce their existing beliefs, right? They also perceive messages in ways that do that, and they remember those messages. So kind of even making people aware of these patterns of human behavior, right? The idea of complex contagion, the idea that the more you're exposed to something, that the greater chance there is of adopting and resharing and sharing these ideas. And of course, we can see how these human characteristics really go well with the algorithms, right? Because they just get reinforced even more strongly. So what we end up with is echo chambers. So I think kind of getting people to recognize these phenomena and how we can kind of break away from them. And this is actually a lot of the work that's being done on the ground. Like, how can we recognize the ways in which we are doing this? How can we recognize how we're selectively exposing ourselves to messages or perceiving certain messages? How can we recognize the dangers of this kind of repetitive, and how can we use those same strategies to counter the kind of messages we don't want, right? How can we use this idea of complex contagion, right? Repeating messages over and over again, recognizing that it's going to take that in order to counter the problematic messages that are we're being exposed to in the same way. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, but that's what I would add.
No, that's great. Thank you. One of the questions from the crowd, how did Hitler rely on Edward Bernays and his perspective on public relations and propaganda to formulate his message?
It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that Hitler was aware of Bernays's work. It's some say that Goebbels was well familiar with it. I think that Hitler, much of what Hitler wrote about propaganda, for instance, in Mein Kampf, which is among the more lucid aspects, seems in many ways to be drawn from what Gustave Le Bon, the French sociologist, talked about with crowd behavior and crowd psychology. I think that the Nazis were astute learners from various groups. I mean, Hitler talked about what he learned from the Allies in the First World War, and that German propaganda was a failure in the First World War. And he studied this. There was a collector of wartime propaganda in Munich, and Hitler would go there in the early 1920s and look at that collection and learn from it. The Nazis studied this, and there was a great deal of fascination, not just among the Nazis, but in propaganda in general in the 1920s. And they were looking at, in part driven by the First World War, because there was a kind of a widespread belief that one of the reasons Germany lost the war was because of the success of Allied propaganda, and that Allied propaganda not only mobilized its population to, around, very emotional goals or presenting the enemy as an evil Hun, but also that propaganda sapped Germany's will to fight. And those were very, that was deeply ingrained in Hitler's mindset and those of other Nazis, and Hitler kept repeating, there's never going to be another November 1918 again in German history, that there was not going to be another repeat of Germany's loss as a result of that. So the Nazis learned from the communists, they learned from the fascists, they learned from the Americans, etc. They learned from a great number of people.
One question that comes up, and it raises this to other events. I'll read this and see if any of you have comments to this. From what we heard from the esteemed panel, Stephen, Lisa, and Gavin, as to how the Nazi, Russian, Rohingya crisis occurred and applied to what's happening in India today, and I'm not sure how read up y'all are on what's happening in India. One can easily see the same principles being applied there: propaganda, fake news, trolls, other narrative, nationalism, and so on. And my guess, maybe this is referring to some of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that's happening there. I'm just curious if any of you all are tracking that. But I'm just curious, like, how can the community of scholars and governments help to prevent either the next atrocity, the next Rohingya crisis, or the next thing that might, in this case, what this person's suggesting could happen in India? But whether or not it happens in India or not, we will surely see other genocides in our future, other uses of propaganda to attack minority populations. And just beyond the United States, how can we track that? How can we monitor that? How can we identify these things before they happen to stop them?
I'll just jump in and say we need to listen to local people on the ground who are telling us about this. It's not like those are the people who know, right? Like, I mean, that's what we really need to be doing more of that. I think we also need to be promoting the networking among those groups, because they are the ones that are familiar with what's going on the ground. They together collectively can also be very powerful in teaching us, those of us who sit comfortably in capital cities outside of these areas, what it is we need to be doing, how we can help.
I would just add to that, great advice, that I think it's important, particularly for those of us who have focus on the international stage, that have seen some of these issues kind of unfolding in other regions of the world. It's important to kind of point out and be explicit, certainly without going down a slippery slope argument, but saying, look, the logical extension of some of these types of behaviors is violence, atrocity, criminality. And so kind of being explicit about that and being upfront that look, these types of things that are being advocated by a certain group in other regions and in other parts of history, they have led to X, Y, and Z. And I think we too seldom do that. And it's to our detriment that then it kind of breeds that apathy and that tolerance for what's essentially dehumanizing behavior.
If I could just add in something, the museum has the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide, which looks at issues of contemporary mass atrocities and genocide, and they've done a number of fact-finding trips, including to Myanmar, and worked with the Yazidis in Iraq, and worked on reports for the government, and also worked on created a kind of a workbook for people on the ground dealing with dangerous speech and how they could counter that, record what kind of speech was there, what kind of characteristics it had, so it was giving, helping to give people on the ground some tools in which they could address this. And I think the key thing is to put together, a lot of disparate international groups to work on these issues. And I want to make another plug, which is, I think one of the challenges that human rights activists often have is that they write for each other, that they don't write for the general public. And I think it's important for these things to get out to the general public, not just for other activists, not just for other people in the government, and influencers, but to raise awareness of in the general public. So I'm going to make that push too.
Can I add one more thing too? I would like to really point out that we are losing the investment in investigative reporting that we really need. And I don't mean just investigative reporting at the national level. I mean really working together across international lines. And let's get away from this idea of the fixer in another country as not a journalist, right? Like, let's actually talk about how we can cross communicate as journalists. You know, I would love to see us break away from the current model of global news production in which the foreign correspondent is the star of the show, and see much more kind of real international collaboration in investigative journalism. I think that would be very, very helpful.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to this definition of propaganda again. We have sort of two questions that relate to this. And I'll add in a third and tie that in for you all. One, my broad observation is we tend to use propaganda for the bad things, right? I mean, if this was a symposium on what the U.S. is doing to communicate to audiences abroad, we would most definitely not be using the word propaganda. At least I probably wouldn't in framing it. But in a way, like information is information, and it's being obviously skewed toward a purpose, and that could well fit the definition that Stephen had. So that's one observation. The second observation relates to a comment, and I'll read this. I think that propaganda always serves the goals of the sender of the message. Information, on the other hand, can, for example, be a servant of propaganda according to the direction of mass media, like in dictatorships. In a democracy, information should be independent. And my question is, how do speakers think of this question? Maybe related to the independent of media and the role of propaganda. And then the third question is, which I'd love to have Shelley talk about, but is all public relations propaganda? So I'm just curious what you all think about this issue of propaganda. How is it defined in terms of who's sending it? And is that just our own bias to protect ourselves in these definitions? Gavin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably less satisfying, but I don't think it's ever going to be possible to kind of distill out all of the imperatives, you know, for profit and for duty to shareholders in the case of the social media companies, et cetera. But I think some of that is addressed through better transparency. And I think that needs to happen, absolutely. It's important that we, you know, understand that from a newspaper to a social media platform, these are not human rights NGOs in embryo that are struggling to kind of perfect the art. These are, in a lot of instances, you know, profit-driven, publicly traded companies, corporate behemoths with global footprints that are very successful at what they do. And so, holding them to account for that, but then tempering our own expectations of the degree to which they're necessarily going to be able to kind of help us counter some of these issues, I think is important. To the question of kind of the definition, I think there again, the pejorative, for me at least, should be reserved for those instances where there's a lack of transparency, where there's some effort to be covert or clandestine in the propagation of some of these narratives, where, you know, strategic communications or public diplomacy, what have you, those can be kind of the benchmarks for those can be in the degree of verification and transparency that are behind them, even if there are imperatives such as governmental, national security, profit, even if those are transparent and upfront, they're upfront about them, I think that breeds a lot more trust and reinforces the value of that messaging.
Thank you.
Okay, so I am a media scholar, so I'm going to frame this in terms of media journalism and so on. I mean, in terms of kind of this global standards of journalism, I think the move away from propaganda was definitely the way in which global standards of journalism were taught, right? It's not propaganda. What we're doing is objective, right? And that was really also the way that we exported our training to many parts of the world, so that we had, in Myanmar's case, I'll just give an example, when the 88 uprising happened and students fled to the borders, they were openly calling themselves the propaganda department of whatever political organization. Then with many, many trainings, they've learned, the concepts of objectivity, and, they've kind of evolved using the global standards of journalism. But now we're starting to see questions about that on the ground, as well as, of course, like in many disciplines, the concept of objectivity is quite challenged, right? And in journalism, it's a normative concept, right? It's something to be, striven for. But I think one thing we haven't talked very much about is what do journalists in context of violence do, right? I mean, there's no way you can really be objective in that sense when your own community is being violently attacked. And so I think there's this kind of circle coming around now, not to calling it propaganda, but recognizing the need for, emotion in journalism, the power of emotion in journalism, the recognition that emotion, and because objectivity was very much about fact and removing emotion from journalism. So I think that there's a kind of a circle, in a sense. We're coming back to some real questions about, I think more the positive aspects of what you're calling good propaganda, right? Like to really think about, what it means to be a journalist that's an advocate for nonviolence, or an advocate for truth as opposed to misinformation, right? Like this is a new kind of call for a certain kind of advocacy. We have to stand for something. The he said, she said doesn't work, right? It's not working for us. So those are questions that I think that are happening in the journalism field. And a lot of these things are coming, again, from areas of violence where much of the research really has assumed that conflict journalism is parachuting in from the West and doing your report and leaving, right? When in fact, much of the actual journalism that's happening is happening in the communities that are facing the violence.
Thank you.
Well, it's a very interesting question. If I could just touch on some of the American angle, in the United States, dating back to the time of the First World War, there was like a real reticence, a reluctance to use the term propaganda. I mean, when the U.S. Propaganda Agency was set up in 1917, it was called the Committee on Public Information. And the person who was the head of it, journalist George Creel, very gifted man, in his book, written after the war, which was called How We Advertised America, he talked about how, we don't use the word propaganda. That's something that Germans do. We base ours on truth. And of course, afterwards, there was a big debate about, and a fear among many within the journalist community, that propaganda could get people to walk in lockstep or do things that they didn't want to do. And there was a big debate, how do you deal with it? And there was one person that said the only cure for propaganda is more propaganda, which is the idea that, and also to encourage, his solution was that instead of reading just your own newspaper, read the opposing one. So to get a much broader perspective on what's happening. The question, and of course, in the Second World War, again, there was this reluctance on in the Roosevelt administration. So the first propaganda agency was the Office of Facts and Figures. You can't come up with anything more boring than that. And then then it's the Committee on, then it's the Office of War Information. And again, a lot of these are headed by journalists. because journalists are used to getting Elmer Davis headed that. And of course, then later on, Edward R. Murrow worked after he left CBS, did work with the US government and its kind of propaganda agency. There's a lot of tie-ins between the journalist community and propaganda. I think sometimes in the United States, there are a lot of euphemisms that are developed so you don't have to use the word propaganda. It's still bad, So I think that there's an American issue with the word, and I think it's translated into a lot of euphemisms and ways to get around it. But that's my thought.
Thanks. I'll add this one additional clarifying comment that came down. Public relations is not propaganda. We have known this since Bernays. Propaganda is always the message of the messenger. This is especially true in a dictatorship. Public relations presupposes democracy, and democracy presupposes public relations, and PR needs democracy, and democracy needs PR. Well, with that, we've run about an hour and 18 minutes. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'd love to hear any closing thoughts you all have, maybe starting with Lisa, but any sort of final thoughts on the topic of today?
I think for me, no, it's okay. I think for me, I really would like to re-emphasize that we need to really start working across borders to really recognize, do more comparative research, do more work in networking, especially groups on the ground that are really the targets of these kinds of campaigns that we see on social media, but also, really we're talking about militant nationalism, we're talking about populism, we're talking about fundamentalism, right? These are big issues, and how are they manifesting in specific contexts, and what can we do across national borders to really deal with this? How can we learn? How can we learn from those communities that are most targeted? I think those are really valuable and useful things that we could really build on.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, I would say just from a Russia perspective, I would just say that often part of the operation in and of itself is to prompt a reaction, and that reaction is in and of itself the outcome. And that's certainly not unique to Russian propaganda. That's practiced widely among talking heads in the United States. But I would just say be wary of the inadvertent amplification of the disinformation or the propaganda or the messaging that's coming out, even in condemning it or pointing it out. Oftentimes that is the way that it's getting amplified. So I think that's something that we've struggled to kind of message, certainly during my time at the White House, that oftentimes that reaction or that condemnation is the intended effect. And so bearing that in mind, I think, is important.
Thanks, Kevin. And Steve, final thoughts.
Yeah, and I come back to the question that you raised at the end about public relations and the distinction between public relations and propaganda, and it reminded me of a couple of different things. One, after they came to power, the Nazis hired 2 PR firms in the United States that specialized in dealing with clients that had bad image problems. 2 prominent New York firms, and Goebbels hired them to create a more positive image of Nazi Germany in the United States. Now, of course, one of the things that came out of that was there was a congressional investigation into that, that ultimately created both something that's gone down in American history in a negative way, HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee, which emerged out of these discussions. But the other thing was you had the Foreign Agents Act of 1938, which still exists today, in which PR firms, journalists, various acting in the interests of foreign governments have to register with the US government. You know, so I think that there are kind of links to this history that still exists today. But I wanted to just bring in that PR link because sometimes there is that kind of fine line between when something is propaganda and when something is public relations. And in the case of the Nazis, they clearly were using public relations firms, or hope to for propagandistic purposes.
Well, thank you.
Sorry, can I just point out that that is
Sure.
still happening? That is still happening. I mean, there are many countries that have hired PR firms, many from the United States, and not in the interest of democracy.
Yes, I'm aware that some Middle Eastern countries have done this to some effect Yeah. No,
And
it's an interesting point.
Myanmar as well.
Yeah, right. I mean, so I think it highlights the point that professional communicators, and obviously the goal of this event series is to help professional communicators use their trade and their skills and expertise to help promote democracy and counter some of the propaganda that might be attacking it. But obviously those skills can go both ways, and that's something always to remember. Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, Steve. This has been fascinating. I'm so excited that we got to talk about this topic and that we had a chance to enlist you three into this discussion. So thank you. Shelley, thank you for sponsoring this event. Thank you to your sponsors for promoting, for helping to support this. You know, I'm just really excited to be a part of this. And just to highlight for everyone, in 2 weeks, please put it on your calendars. Please go to the PR Museum's website and register for the next event on how QAnon, Proud Boys, and extremist media destroyed public trust. And then 2 weeks after that, we have understand how communicators can help preserve democracy. So thank you all very much, and really excited, and thank you to the audience for participating, especially those that stuck through it this long. So thank you.